Paris, August 2003. Neighbours open an apartment door and step back from a smell they will never forget. Inside, an elderly man has been dead for days. Nobody noticed, nobody came. Outside, the temperature is pushing 104 degrees Fahrenheit, day after day, with no relief at night. By the end of that month, close to 15,000 people are dead in France alone. Across Europe, the toll climbs past 70,000. Refrigerated trucks line the streets of Paris. A vegetable market becomes a morgue. We are going to walk through the deadliest heatwave on record. A silent killer with no explosion, no flood, no warning siren. A heat wave that crept through hospitals, apartments and nursing homes and killed more people than almost any hurricane in modern history. We will see how a human body actually dies from heat. We will see why the elderly died alone and why nobody was watching. And we will connect it straight to this year, when France just broke its own heat record again. If you want more stories like this, hit subscribe. It helps more than you'd think. Prepare yourselves. This is what happens when the temperature simply refuses to drop. The stairwell smelled wrong. That was the first sign. It was late August 2003, and Parisians were streaming back into the city after their summer vacations. Suitcases rolled across cobblestones, windows were thrown open, life restarted, the way it always did after the August break. Then, in building after building, neighbours climbing the stairs noticed something under the usual city smells of coffee and bread. Something sour. Something that got worse near certain doors. Behind those doors, elderly residents had been dead for days. Some had been dead for more than a week. Nobody had checked on them. Nobody had called. Their mail piled up. Their windows stayed shut against a heat that had already killed them. This was not one apartment. This was happening across the city, in ordinary buildings on ordinary streets. People who had lived alone, who saw a neighbour now and then, who managed fine most years. This year, the heat found them first. Paris in August is famously empty. Close to half the city leaves for vacation every summer, a tradition so old nobody questions it anymore. Doctors leave. Pharmacists leave. Even some hospital staff take their turn. The city runs on a skeleton crew and everyone assumes that's fine, because nothing ever happens in August. Something happened in August 2003. A heat wave had settled over Europe in early July, and by the first days of August it had turned into something else entirely. Temperatures in Paris climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there, day after day, refusing to break. Worse, the night stayed hot too. No cool relief at 3 in the morning. No chance for the body to recover. For a healthy adult with air conditioning, this meant a miserable week. For an 80-year-old alone on the 6th floor of a building with no elevator, in an apartment with no air conditioning, in a country where fewer than 1 in 5 homes had it, this meant something closer to a slow-motion emergency, and nobody was watching closely enough to catch it in time. By the time family members returned from their own vacations, some found their parents and grandparents had been gone for over a week. The coroners could barely keep up. Funeral homes ran out of space. This was the first hint of a catastrophe so large it would take the country weeks to fully understand what had happened, and years to fully explain how it had gone unnoticed for so long. We are watching the opening scene of the deadliest heatwave ever recorded. A disaster with no flood, no fire, no collapsed buildings, just heat, silence, and a country that looked away at exactly the wrong moment. The apartment smell was the first clue. The full scale of what was happening was still hidden, spread across a continent, building day by day inside hospitals, farms, and forgotten rooms. Paris was only the beginning. Farther out, across France, the numbers were already climbing past anything the country's health system had ever prepared for. Nobody sounds an alarm for warm weather. At the start of July 2003, forecasters watched a familiar pattern build over Europe. Warm air, clear skies, the kind of stretch that makes for good vacation photos. Nothing about it screamed disaster. Summers get hot, that's what summers do, but this heat behaved differently from the start. A massive area of high pressure parked itself over Western Europe and simply would not move. Think of it like a lid pressed down over a pot, trapping hot air underneath instead of letting it escape. Normally weather systems drift. Storms come through, temperatures drop, the air resets. This system stayed locked in place for weeks, and every day it sat there, the ground beneath it grew hotter and drier. By early August, that slow build had become something extreme. Cities across France, Italy, Spain, and Germany began breaking temperature records that had stood for over a century, some for over 500 years. Places accustomed to mild European summers were suddenly baking under desert-like heat, with none of the infrastructure built for it. Here is the part that made 2003 so dangerous. This wasn't a 2-day spike. A short blast of heat is uncomfortable, but survivable, especially for a healthy population. This was different. The extreme heat lasted for nearly 3 weeks straight, with almost no break. Day after day, the thermometer climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and night after night it barely dropped. That detail matters more than most people realize. A single hot day rarely kills anyone. It's the accumulation, one hot day stacked on another, with no cool night to let the body recover, that turns dangerous. Doctors call this cumulative heat stress, and it is far deadlier than any single record-breaking afternoon. At first, though, nobody framed it that way. News coverage treated the heat as a minor story, a footnote next to summer vacations and beach photos. Weather presenters mentioned record highs almost cheerfully. Nobody was tracking hospital admissions in real time. Nobody was counting the elderly who lived alone. France's National Weather Service did issue an early warning in the first week of August, flagging the unusual conditions. But the warning moved through the system slowly, filtered through agencies more used to preparing for floods and storms than for a heatwave that simply refused to end. There was no established alarm bell for this kind of disaster, no sirens, no evacuation plan. Heat had never been treated as a major threat before, so nobody had built the systems to respond to one. By the time officials realized what was actually happening, the heatwave was already deep into its second week, and the death toll was climbing far faster than anyone had accounted for. The lid stayed on the pot. Underneath it, in hospitals, apartments, and nursing homes across the continent, the pressure was already building toward a catastrophe nobody had predicted, and almost nobody was prepared to stop. Picture a school gym on the hottest day of summer, doors locked, no fans, no windows open. Now imagine that gym stretching across an entire continent and staying locked shut for 3 straight weeks. That is close to what happened over Europe in the summer of 2003. Meteorologists call it a blocking high. A giant dome of high-pressure air settles over a region and simply refuses to budge. Normal weather systems move like cars on a highway, one pushing the next one out of the way. A blocking high acts more like a car that has stalled in the fast lane. Everything behind it backs up, nothing gets through. This particular dome sat over Western Europe for most of July and into August. Skies stayed clear. The sun poured down uninterrupted, heating the ground a little more each day. With no storms moving in, and no cooler air arriving from the Atlantic, there was nothing to break the cycle. The ground itself became part of the problem. Weeks of dry weather had already left soil across France, and much of southern Europe parched. Dry ground heats up faster than moist ground, because moisture normally soaks up extra energy through evaporation. Without that natural cooling effect, the land baked even harder, which then heated the air above it even more. Heat built on heat, feeding itself. Rivers dropped to levels not seen in decades. In the Alps, glaciers that had survived centuries of summers began melting at an alarming pace, sending unusually high and fast meltwater rushing into rivers below, even as the drought dried up everything else around them. For France in particular, the timing could not have been worse. The most severe stretch hit in the first 2 weeks of August, exactly when the country traditionally empties out for vacation. Farmers watched crops wither in fields. Wildfires broke out across southern regions. Portugal recorded the highest temperature of the entire event, over 117 degrees Fahrenheit, a number that would stand as Europe's hottest verified reading for years afterward. None of this was freak, random bad luck. Scientists who studied the event afterward found that the atmospheric pattern responsible, this stubborn blocking high, was itself becoming more common as global temperatures rose. The lid on the pot was not an isolated fluke, it was a preview. For the people living underneath that dome, none of the meteorology mattered. What mattered was that the heat did not stop. Not for one day, not for one night. And the human body, it turns out, was never built to survive that kind of relentless, unbroken heat for very long. Your body runs at about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. It defends that number the way a thermostat defends a room, constantly adjusting, constantly working. Push your core temperature up by just a few degrees, and everything starts to break down. At normal temperatures, your body cools itself mainly through sweat. Sweat evaporates off your skin and carries heat away with it, like steam lifting off a hot road after rain. It's an efficient system, one that has kept humans alive in deserts and jungles for thousands of years. But that system has limits. When the air outside gets hot enough and humid enough, sweat stops evaporating efficiently. It just sits on your skin instead of pulling heat away. Your body's main cooling tool stops working at the exact moment you need it most. Here is where it gets dangerous inside your body. As your core temperature rises, your blood vessels near the skin widen, rushing blood to the surface to shed heat. That sounds helpful, but it comes at a cost. Blood gets pulled away from your stomach and intestines. Your blood pressure drops. Your heart has to work much harder, pumping faster just to keep you conscious. For someone with a healthy heart, that's a serious strain. For an 80-year-old with existing heart disease, which described a huge share of the people who died in 2003, it can be the final push toward cardiac arrest. Meanwhile, the walls of your gut, deprived of their normal blood supply, can start leaking toxins that are usually safely contained. Those toxins spill into your bloodstream, triggering inflammation and even blood clotting throughout the body. Doctors describe it as a cascade, one system failing, then dragging the next one down with it. If your core temperature keeps climbing past about 104 degrees Fahrenheit, you cross into heat stroke. Confusion sets in. Some victims become disoriented, unable to recognize they're in danger, unable to call for help even if a phone sits right beside them. Left unchecked, organs begin failing: kidneys, liver, brain. Death can follow within hours. This is why age matters so much. Older bodies sweat less efficiently. Hearts already weakened by disease can't handle the extra strain. And many elderly people take medications that interfere with the body's natural cooling response without them even realizing it. None of this required some exotic weather event beyond human experience. It required only what Europe got in August 2003, heat that did not relent, for people whose bodies could not keep pace. The mechanism was simple. The results were not. Multiply that failing system by tens of thousands of vulnerable bodies across an entire continent, and you get a disaster that unfolded almost invisibly. One apartment, one hospital bed, one collapsed elderly resident at a time. A hot day is uncomfortable. A hot day followed by a hot night is what actually kills people. This is one of the most counterintuitive facts about deadly heat waves, and it is exactly what made August 2003 so lethal. It wasn't just the daytime highs, brutal as they were. It was that the temperature barely dropped after sunset. Under normal conditions, nighttime is recovery time for the human body. Even on a scorching summer day, temperatures typically fall enough after dark to let your core body temperature ease back down. Your heart gets a break. Your organs get a break. It's the reset button that lets you survive the next hot day. During the worst stretch of the 2003 heat wave, that reset button stopped working. In parts of France, overnight lows stayed above 86 degrees Fahrenheit, night after night. Bedrooms that had been baking all day never had the chance to cool down. People went to sleep hot and woke up hotter, their bodies never getting a real break from the strain. Researchers who study heat waves have a name for this. They look specifically at how many consecutive nights stay above a dangerous threshold, because that number predicts the death toll better than the daytime peak temperature does. A single scorching afternoon, followed by a cool night, rarely kills healthy people. Repeated hot nights, stacked one after another with no relief, is what pushes vulnerable bodies past the point of no return. Think of it like running on no sleep. Miss one night of rest and you're groggy but functional. Miss night after night in a row, and your whole system starts to break down. Your judgment slips, your immune system weakens, your heart works overtime just to keep up. Now imagine that sleep deprivation happening to an 85-year-old, alone in an apartment with no fan, whose heart already struggles under normal conditions. This is exactly what researchers found when they later studied a similar disaster in Chicago in 1995. The nights that never cooled down were the biggest single factor separating that heat wave from ordinary summer discomfort. The same pattern applied across Europe in 2003, magnified across an entire continent for close to 3 weeks straight. Air conditioning breaks this deadly cycle instantly. A cooled bedroom lets the body recover overnight, no matter how brutal the day outside has been. But in 2003, fewer than 1 in 5 French households had any air conditioning at all. Most people had no way to escape the heat, even while they slept. Day after day, night after night, the strain compounded, and the group least equipped to handle that compounding strain, the elderly, living alone, often unaware of just how much danger they were in, was about to become the centre of the entire tragedy. There is a number that can predict whether a heat wave turns deadly, and it has nothing to do with the number you see on your weather app. It's called wet bulb temperature, and it measures something more specific than plain heat. It combines temperature with humidity to show how well your body can actually cool itself through sweat. The name comes from how it's measured. Wrap a wet cloth around a thermometer bulb and let air pass over it. As water evaporates off the cloth, the thermometer cools down, the same way sweat cools your skin. In dry air, that evaporation happens fast, and the wet bulb reading drops well below the actual air temperature. That's why desert heat, brutal as it feels, is often more survivable than people expect. Sweat evaporates quickly and does its job. Humid air changes everything. When the air's already thick with moisture, sweat can't evaporate efficiently, because the air has no more room to absorb it. Your body's cooling system stalls out, even though you're still sweating. Scientists have identified a critical threshold, a wet bulb temperature of around 87 degrees Fahrenheit for young, healthy adults. Cross that line, and even sitting still in the shade with plenty of water, the body can no longer shed heat fast enough. For older adults, that danger point drops even lower, closer to 82 degrees. Push wet bulb readings up toward 95 degrees, once thought to be an absolute survival limit for anyone, and death becomes likely within hours, regardless of age or fitness. France in August 2003 never reached the most extreme readings on that scale, but it didn't need to. Combined with the relentless overnight heat and weeks without relief, conditions pushed millions of people, especially the elderly, past their personal cooling limits, over and over, day after day. Here's what makes this number so important for understanding our future. As the planet warms, wet bulb extremes are becoming more common in places that used to be safe from them. Parts of the Persian Gulf and South Asia have already recorded brief spikes brushing against the most extreme end of that scale, conditions scientists once assumed were decades away. Wet bulb temperature doesn't show up on the evening news. There's no bright red number flashing a warning. But it may be the single most important measurement for understanding which heat waves turn into mass casualty events, and which ones simply make for an uncomfortable week. In 2003, almost nobody outside a small circle of researchers had heard the term. That was about to change, as doctors scrambled to explain why so many people, especially the oldest and most isolated among them, were dying at a rate the country had never seen before. Look at who died in France that August, and one pattern stands out above all others: age. The overwhelming majority of victims were elderly, many over 75. Within that group, women outnumbered men significantly, largely because women tend to live longer and were more likely to be living alone by that point in life. Age itself changes how the body handles heat. Sweat glands become less responsive over time. The heart, especially if weakened by decades of wear or existing disease, struggles far more under the extra strain that heat places on it. Many older adults also take medications for blood pressure, for depression, for a dozen common conditions that interfere with the body's natural cooling response without any obvious warning sign. But biology only explains part of the story. The other part is isolation. France, like much of Western Europe, had seen a major shift over previous decades. More elderly people were living alone, in their own apartments rather than with extended family. For most of the year, this arrangement worked fine. Many managed independently, saw neighbours occasionally, and lived full lives. August broke that arrangement completely. Adult children left for vacation. Home health aides took their own time off. Doctors' offices closed for weeks at a stretch. The informal safety net that normally checked in on elderly residents, a daughter's weekly visit, a neighbour's habit of knocking, simply vanished for the exact 3 weeks when it was needed most. Picture an 87-year-old woman living alone on the 5th floor of a building with no elevator. Going outside to a cooler public space means climbing down 5 flights of stairs in brutal heat and climbing back up again, itself a serious risk. Staying inside in an apartment with no air conditioning and windows that trap heat carries its own danger. Many chose to stay inside, and many of those did not survive the choice. Researchers later found something else striking. In wealthier neighbourhoods, deaths were noticeably lower. Money bought air conditioning, bought easier access to cooled spaces, bought family members with more flexibility to check in. In poorer neighbourhoods, especially those with large elderly populations, the death rate climbed sharply. Heat waves, it turns out, are not equal opportunity killers. They find the cracks in a society and go straight through them. By the time officials began to grasp the true scale of what was happening, nearly 100 people in Paris alone had died with nobody even aware they were in danger. Their bodies would not be discovered for days, sometimes weeks. The system meant to protect them, one built on family visits and neighbourly habits, had quietly failed at the worst possible moment. France had never needed air conditioning, or so the thinking went for generations. Compared to the American South or the Middle East, French summers were historically mild. Paris rarely broke 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Homes were built from thick stone designed to hold cool air, a smart strategy for centuries of ordinary summers. Air conditioning was seen as an American extravagance, unnecessary and even a little wasteful for a country with a temperate climate. By 2003, fewer than 1 in 5 households in France had any form of air conditioning. Hospitals fared only slightly better. Many nursing homes, the exact buildings housing the country's most vulnerable population, had none at all. This wasn't unique to France. Across much of Europe, the same assumption held. Extreme heat was a problem for other parts of the world, not for a continent used to grey skies and mild summers. Infrastructure reflected that assumption everywhere, from building codes to emergency planning. The 2003 heatwave shattered that assumption in the span of 3 weeks. Hospitals without adequate cooling became dangerous for patients rather than safe havens. Nursing homes turned into some of the deadliest locations of the entire disaster, packed with elderly residents whose bodies were least equipped to handle sustained heat, inside buildings with no way to bring the temperature down. Even where portable cooling units existed, most of France's power grid and building infrastructure had never been designed to run them at scale. When hospitals scrambled to bring in emergency fans and cooling equipment, some faced electrical systems that struggled under the sudden demand. Compare this to countries in hotter climates. Cities across the American Southwest, the Middle East and parts of Asia had decades of experience building around extreme heat, better insulation, widespread air conditioning, public cooling centres woven into daily infrastructure. France had none of that experience because it had never needed it before. That gap between infrastructure and reality proved lethal. Doctors treating heat stroke patients found themselves fighting the same battle their buildings were fighting. No reliable way to bring body temperatures, or room temperatures, back down quickly enough. The heat wave forced a hard lesson that has since been repeated across the world. Infrastructure built for yesterday's climate can turn deadly the moment that climate shifts, even by what seems like a modest few degrees. France would spend the following years rebuilding around that lesson. In August 2003, the country was still learning it the hardest way possible, inside hospital wards that were supposed to save lives, and instead became overwhelmed by the very heat they couldn't escape. Hospitals are supposed to be where a crisis gets absorbed. In August 2003, French hospitals became part of the crisis itself. August is peak vacation season across France, and hospital staffing follows the same national rhythm as everything else. Senior doctors take their turn away. Specialist units run with reduced teams. It's a system built on the assumption that summer, especially August, brings a quieter, more manageable patient load. That assumption collapsed almost overnight. As the heat wave intensified in the first 2 weeks of August, emergency rooms across the country began filling with patients suffering heat stroke, severe dehydration, and cardiac events triggered by the extreme temperatures. Many of these patients were elderly, arriving confused, sometimes barely conscious, sometimes already in organ failure by the time they reached a hospital bed. Staff who remained on duty found themselves stretched far beyond normal capacity, treating a wave of critical patients with fewer colleagues than a typical week, let alone a crisis. Some hospitals, lacking sufficient air conditioning themselves, struggled to keep their own wards cool enough to safely treat patients suffering from heat-related illness in the first place. It became a strange, cruel irony. Patients arriving because their homes were too hot, being treated in hospital rooms that weren't much cooler. Emergency medical services faced a similar strain. Paris firefighters, who respond to a significant share of medical emergencies in the city, saw call volumes spike dramatically as the heatwave peaked, far outpacing anything a normal August prepared them for. Doctors who lived through those weeks later described scenes of quiet chaos, gurneys lining hallways, refrigeration units repurposed to cool patients, staff working extended shifts because there simply weren't enough replacements to call in on short notice. One physician who tracked the crisis closely later noted that the true scale of what was happening only became clear well after the worst of it had already passed, as death records were compiled and cross-checked against a normal summer's baseline. That delay mattered enormously. In a fast-moving disaster like a wildfire or a flood, the scale is visible almost immediately. A heat wave offers no such clarity. Deaths trickled in one at a time, spread across the entire country, often recorded simply as cardiac arrest or respiratory failure, rather than being tied back to the heat itself. Nobody was adding up the full picture in real time. By the time hospital administrators and public health officials began comparing notes, the heatwave had already been raging for nearly 2 weeks. The system meant to catch this crisis early had been operating with a skeleton staff and no clear alarm bell, and the gap between what was happening and what officials understood was about to become the story that defined the entire disaster. France had a national weather service. France had a national health ministry. Neither one sounded a loud enough alarm in time. Météo France, the national forecasting agency, did track the building heat and issued warnings as temperatures climbed in early August. But those warnings moved through a system that had never treated heat as a major public health threat. There was no established colour-coded alert level tied to automatic emergency response, no clear trigger that said, "This is now a national health crisis, act immediately." Compare that to how France and most countries handle other disasters. A major storm triggers evacuation orders, a flood triggers emergency shelters. Heat, historically, triggered nothing more than a mention on the evening weather segment. Nobody had built the infrastructure to treat rising temperatures with the same urgency as rising floodwaters. Inside the health ministry, the picture was similarly fragmented. Different agencies tracked different pieces of the puzzle. Hospital admissions here, mortality statistics there, but no single system pulled that data together quickly enough to reveal the true scale of what was happening. Reports that did raise concerns moved slowly through bureaucratic channels, arriving on the desks of senior officials days or even weeks after the situation on the ground had already turned into a mass casualty event. Government leaders themselves were largely out of the country, or out of the capital, following the same vacation calendar as much of France. The health minister at the time faced fierce criticism afterward for not returning from vacation sooner, for underestimating a crisis that emergency room doctors and undertakers could already see clearly building around them. By August 9th, the first heat-related death made national news. By then, the toll was already climbing into the thousands, though almost nobody outside select emergency rooms and funeral homes knew it yet. Journalists later found that the earliest and most detailed warnings actually came not from top officials, but from funeral directors who watched their business volumes spike far beyond anything a normal August produced, and began sounding alarms of their own. It took close to 2 more weeks for the government to fully grasp the scale of the disaster and respond with real urgency. By that point, the worst of the deaths had already happened. The warning system that should have caught this early, that should have triggered emergency measures for the elderly and isolated, simply hadn't existed in a form built for this kind of threat. France would rebuild that system from scratch in the aftermath. In the moment, though, the country was flying blind through the deadliest 3 weeks of weather in its modern history, and the person meant to be steering that response was, for a critical stretch, nowhere near the capital. President Jacques Chirac was at his country retreat when the death toll crossed into the thousands. For a nation growing increasingly aware that something catastrophic was unfolding, his continued absence became a symbol, fair or not, of a government caught completely off guard. French citizens watching funeral homes overwhelmed and hearing whispered stories of elderly neighbours found too late wanted to see their leaders responding with urgency. Instead, for much of the crisis, the response felt distant and slow. Prime Minister Jean-Pierre Raffarin's government faced the sharpest criticism. As the scale of the disaster became undeniable, officials scrambled to explain how a death toll this large could have unfolded without triggering an earlier, more forceful response. Health Minister Jean-François Mattei, who did return to work and visit hospitals during the crisis, still faced intense scrutiny over how quickly, or slowly, official warnings had moved. The political fallout arrived fast once the numbers became public. What began as a public health catastrophe quickly became a national reckoning about government accountability, about whether a modern, wealthy country had simply failed to notice tens of thousands of its citizens dying inside their own homes. Chirac eventually did address the nation, acknowledging the scale of the tragedy and announcing investigations into what had gone wrong. But for many French citizens, the damage to public trust had already been done. The image that stuck wasn't a president managing a crisis. It was a president who had been slow to even recognise one. This pattern, official leadership caught flat-footed by a slow-moving disaster, would echo in future heat waves around the world. Heat rarely announces itself the way a hurricane does, with days of forecasted warning and dramatic satellite imagery. It arrives quietly, kills quietly, and by the time political leaders grasp the true scale, the worst of the damage is often already done. For France in 2003, the political reckoning became almost as significant as the disaster itself. It forced a level of public scrutiny that no heatwave had ever received before, and it set the stage for sweeping changes to how the country would prepare for the next one. But before those changes could come, the immediate crisis was still unfolding. Hospitals across the country were now facing a problem that went beyond treating the sick. They were running out of room and running out of time for the dead. At the peak of the crisis, French hospitals faced a problem most had never planned for: too many dead to process. Mortuaries inside hospitals are built with a certain baseline capacity in mind. Enough space for a typical week's worth of deaths, plus a reasonable buffer. Nothing about that baseline accounted for a sudden, sustained surge that would push death rates far beyond anything the country had seen in decades. As the heatwave stretched into its second and third weeks, hospital morgues across France began filling completely. Some ran out of refrigerated storage space within days. Funeral homes, already stretched thin by the August vacation schedule, found themselves overwhelmed by call volume that dwarfed anything close to normal. One French funeral association, tracking these numbers in real time, became an unlikely early warning system of its own. Watching their caseloads spike far beyond seasonal norms, industry professionals recognized the scale of the disaster days before official government statistics caught up. By the time officials at the national level acknowledged the severity of what was happening, the death toll had already climbed past 10,000 people, a number initially estimated at just 3,000 only a week earlier. Each new estimate arrived larger than the last, a grim pattern that revealed just how far behind the official response had fallen. Bodies that couldn't be processed quickly enough began piling up in temporary storage, hospital hallways repurposed for the crisis, refrigerated trucks parked outside facilities that had simply run out of room inside. This was not a small logistical hiccup. It was a full breakdown of a system never designed to absorb this scale of loss in this short a window of time. For grieving families, many of whom were still returning from their own August vacations and only just learning what had happened to elderly relatives, the delays compounded an already devastating loss. Some waited days simply to locate where a parent's or grandparent's body had been taken, as overwhelmed facilities struggled to keep accurate records amid the chaos. The scale of this backlog eventually forced officials into a decision nobody wanted to make. They needed an entirely new location, far larger than any hospital morgue, simply to hold the number of bodies the country's normal infrastructure could no longer contain. That decision would lead authorities to a place nobody expected, a wholesale food market on the outskirts of Paris, better known for fruit and vegetables than for the dead, about to become the emergency morgue for a crisis still nowhere near its end. Picture rows of white refrigerated trucks lined up outside a Paris hospital, engines running, doors sealed. Not delivering food, not delivering supplies, holding the overflow that the building's own morgue could no longer contain. This became one of the starkest, most visible symbols of the crisis, as it stretched into its third week. hospitals across the Paris region and beyond faced identical problems at the same time. Too many dead, arriving too quickly, with nowhere left to store them with dignity. Refrigerated trucks, normally used to transport perishable goods, were repurposed almost overnight into makeshift mortuaries. Some were parked directly outside hospital loading docks. Others were positioned near funeral homes that had similarly run out of internal capacity. It was an improvised solution to a problem the country's infrastructure had never been built to handle, cobbled together in real time as the death toll climbed faster than anyone could process. For hospital staff and funeral directors already stretched to their limits, managing this overflow became its own exhausting task. Bodies needed to be tracked, identified, and eventually matched with grieving family members, many of whom were still unaware their relatives had died, scattered across their own vacations in other parts of the country or abroad. The scene outside these facilities offered a rare, visible glimpse of a disaster that had otherwise unfolded almost invisibly. Unlike a hurricane's wreckage or a flood's destruction, this crisis left no broken buildings, no downed power lines, no dramatic footage of the disaster itself. The refrigerated trucks were, in a strange way, the first physical evidence most French citizens saw that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Journalists who photographed these makeshift morgues helped shift public understanding almost overnight. What had been treated as a minor summer weather story just days earlier was suddenly undeniable. Rows of trucks holding bodies outside a modern European hospital in a wealthy nation in the 21st century. Even this solution, though, was only a stopgap. As the days passed and the death toll kept rising, the number of bodies requiring storage soon outpaced even this improvised system. Paris and the surrounding region needed something far larger, a single, centralized location capable of holding thousands, not dozens. Officials found their answer in an unlikely place, a sprawling wholesale market south of the city, normally packed with crates of fruit and vegetables destined for restaurants and grocery stores across the region. It was about to take on a very different purpose. Rungis is the largest wholesale food market in the world. Trucks arrived there before dawn, loaded with produce bound for restaurants and grocery stores across Paris and beyond. In an ordinary August, its refrigerated warehouses hold crates of melons, tomatoes, and leafy greens. In August 2003, one section of that market held something else entirely. As hospital morgues and refrigerated trucks reached their absolute limits, the French government made an emergency decision: convert part of Rungis into a temporary central morgue. The scale of cold storage already built into the facility, designed to keep tons of perishable food fresh, made it one of the only locations in the entire region capable of holding the sheer number of bodies still arriving. The improvised morgue at Rungis was built to hold up to 2,000 bodies at once. Within days, it was operating near that capacity. For many French citizens, this image became the defining symbol of the entire disaster. A market built to feed a city had been repurposed to store its dead, a stark, almost unbearable illustration of just how far the crisis had outpaced the country's ability to respond. Family members arriving to identify and claim relatives found themselves navigating an emotional ordeal layered on top of an already devastating loss. Locating a loved one's body inside a converted food warehouse, processed by staff working around the clock to keep pace with a volume nobody had trained for. Critics were quick to point out the symbolism and the failure it represented. Using a food market as an emergency morgue wasn't just a logistical necessity. For many, it captured something deeper about a government that had been caught completely unprepared, forced into makeshift solutions because no proper system had ever existed for a disaster of this kind. Rungis would go on to serve this same emergency function again in later crises, a grim reminder of how quickly a modern city's systems can be overwhelmed when a disaster doesn't look like the ones officials had planned for. But even as Rungis absorbed thousands of bodies, another part of the tragedy was only beginning to surface. Across Paris, families returning home from their own vacations were about to discover the truth about relatives nobody had checked on, in apartments where the heat and the silence had already done their damage. Late August brought Parisians home in waves, suitcases in hand, suntanned from beaches and countryside trips. For many, that homecoming turned into the worst moment of their lives. Throughout the city, adult children returning from vacation climbed the stairs to parents' apartments and found doors that hadn't been opened in days, sometimes weeks. The smell reached them before anything else, an unmistakable sign of what waited inside. This wasn't a handful of isolated tragedies. It played out across the city, over and over, as families slowly reconnected with elderly relatives after weeks away, only to discover they were already too late. The timing made an already horrific situation even crueler. Many of these deaths had occurred in the first and second weeks of August, right as the heat wave reached its most intense stretch. But because so many people, including the very family members who might have checked in sooner, were themselves away on vacation, the discovery of these deaths lagged days or weeks behind the moment they actually happened. Doctors and coroners processing the cases noted a grim pattern. Bodies found in advanced states of decomposition, a direct result of both the extreme heat accelerating the process and the extended time before anyone discovered what had happened. Some identifications took significantly longer than usual, complicating an already overwhelmed system trying to match names to bodies before those bodies could even be properly examined. For the families involved, the trauma extended far beyond ordinary grief. Many carried a lasting guilt, wondering whether a single phone call during their vacation might have changed the outcome, even though nothing about that summer's heat had been clearly signalled as an emergency at the time. Neighbours too grappled with their own version of that same guilt. In apartment buildings across the city, people who had lived beside these victims for years, sometimes decades, began asking themselves how someone could die so close by and go unnoticed for so long. This wave of delayed discoveries became one of the most emotionally devastating chapters of the entire disaster, and it exposed something the death toll alone couldn't fully capture: just how disconnected daily life in a modern city had become for its oldest and most isolated residents. For a small number of those victims, no family member ever came forward at all, leaving their bodies unclaimed entirely, a final, quiet tragedy still to come. Some victims of the 2003 heatwave had no one left to come looking for them at all. In Paris alone, nearly 100 bodies went completely unclaimed. No family members stepped forward, no friends arrived to identify them. These were people who had lived and died in almost complete isolation, their final weeks unnoticed by anyone close enough to intervene. For officials already overwhelmed by the broader crisis, these cases presented a uniquely difficult problem. Standard procedure required extensive efforts to locate any living relatives before a body could be laid to rest through public burial. Investigators combed through what records existed, sometimes finding distant family members who, for various reasons, chose not to come forward even once located. The people in this group often shared a common thread: elderly, living alone with few or no close social connections remaining. Some had outlived spouses, siblings, and even their own children. Others had simply drifted from family ties over the decades, an experience common enough in any aging population, but one that turned lethal in a crisis defined by isolation. Eventually, officials made the decision to lay these unclaimed victims to rest in a public cemetery on the southern edge of Paris, at the city's expense. It was a sombre, practical resolution to an impossible situation, but for many observers, it became something more than that. It became a symbol. These were, some writers later suggested, among the first widely recognised casualties of a warming climate colliding directly with modern social isolation. People whose deaths revealed not just a dangerous summer, but a deeper vulnerability built into how modern cities function. Ageing populations increasingly living alone. Extended families increasingly spread across cities, countries, and continents. Support systems that worked fine during ordinary weeks and failed completely during extraordinary ones. Researchers who later studied these specific cases in depth found that isolation, even more than age or underlying health conditions alone, was one of the single strongest predictors of who died and who survived. Being checked on, even by someone with no medical training at all, dramatically improved a person's odds of surviving those brutal 3 weeks. That research would go on to reshape how cities around the world thought about heatwave preparedness, less about temperature forecasts alone, and more about identifying and reaching the isolated individuals most likely to fall through the cracks. But that shift in thinking came later. In August 2003, nearly 100 people in Paris alone died with no one left to notice, and the city itself was left to bury them. On the southern outskirts of Paris sits Thiers Cemetery, a large public burial ground that, like most cemeteries, rarely draws outside attention. In the aftermath of the 2003 heatwave, one section of Thiès became the final resting place for the city's unclaimed victims, the nearly 100 people whose bodies nobody came forward to claim. Buried at public expense in simple graves, they represented the most stark and permanent symbol of a disaster, defined by isolation as much as by heat. For journalists and historians who later documented the crisis, these graves became a focal point, a physical place to stand and reckon with an abstract, overwhelming death toll. Numbers like 15,000 can be difficult for anyone to truly absorb. A row of graves, each representing a specific person who died utterly alone, made the tragedy concrete in a way statistics alone never could. Researchers and writers who studied these particular cases in the years that followed worked to piece together who these victims actually were, not just how they died, but who they had been. Their research painted a portrait of lives that had often been quietly difficult long before that August. Elderly individuals who had slipped gradually out of contact with wider society, sometimes due to family estrangement, sometimes due to the simple, slow erosion of social connections that can accompany old age in any modern city. Their stories, once compiled, offered something the raw death toll never could, a window into exactly how a modern wealthy nation could still allow this kind of isolation to exist at such a devastating scale. It wasn't a story about a single failed government policy or a single broken healthcare system. It was a story about the quiet, everyday gaps in how societies check in on their most vulnerable members, gaps that stayed invisible right up until an extreme heatwave exposed them all at once. Thiers Cemetery still holds those graves today, a physical reminder embedded in the landscape of Paris itself. For a country that would go on to completely rebuild its approach to heatwave preparedness, this small section of a public cemetery remains one of the clearest, most human-scale monuments to what happens when a society fails to notice its most isolated members until it's already too late. The human toll in Paris and across France was staggering enough on its own. But August 2003 was not a French tragedy alone. Farther across the continent in Italy, Spain and Germany, the same deadly pattern was unfolding simultaneously, pushing the total death toll toward a number that would place this heatwave among the deadliest natural disasters in modern European history. Here's a strange fact about heatwaves. Most victims never have heat written on their death certificate. When an 80-year-old with existing heart disease dies of a heart attack during a heatwave, the death certificate typically says exactly that: cardiac arrest. The heat that pushed his already strained heart past its limit rarely gets mentioned at all. The same goes for kidney failure, stroke, and respiratory collapse, all conditions that heat can trigger or worsen without ever appearing as the official cause. This is why the true death toll of the 2003 heatwave wasn't captured by simply counting bodies with heat stroke listed as the cause. Researchers had to use a different method entirely, one called excess mortality. Here's how it works. Scientists look at how many people typically die in a given country during a normal August, based on years of historical data. Then they compare that expected number to how many people actually died during the period in question. The difference, the extra deaths beyond what a normal summer would produce, is the real toll of the disaster, regardless of what any individual death certificate says. Using this method, French researchers found that close to 15,000 more people died in the country during August 2003 than would have died in a typical August. Across the wider continent, that same excess mortality method put the total above 70,000, spread across France, Italy, Spain, Germany, and several other countries. This gap between the officially labelled heat deaths and the true excess mortality toll is one of the most important things to understand about how heatwaves work. They rarely kill directly and visibly, the way a hurricane or an earthquake does. Instead, they push already vulnerable bodies past a tipping point, and the result gets recorded as whatever specific organ failed first. This has real consequences beyond the historical record. Because heat deaths are so often undercounted in official statistics, heat waves have historically received far less attention, funding, and emergency planning than disasters with more visible, immediate death tolls. A hurricane that kills 2,000 people generates massive global coverage and disaster relief. A heat wave that kills 10 times that many, spread quietly across hospital beds and lonely apartments over 3 weeks, can pass by with comparatively little notice, at least until researchers go back months later and add up what actually happened. That gap between perception and reality is exactly what happened across Europe in the weeks after August 2003, as health agencies in different countries slowly compiled their own excess mortality data. A picture began emerging that was far larger and far more alarming than anyone had initially grasped. While the human toll dominated headlines, the same heat wave was reshaping the physical landscape of Europe in ways that would take years to fully repair. Farmers across France, Italy and Spain watched crops wither under a relentless sun, and drought conditions that had been building for months before the worst heat arrived. Corn yields collapsed. Vineyards, some centuries old, produced smaller and lower quality harvests than growers had seen in generations. France alone suffered agricultural losses that ran into the billions of dollars, a devastating blow to a country where farming remains deeply tied to both the economy and national identity. Rivers told a similar story. Water levels across the continent dropped to some of their lowest points on record, straining everything from shipping routes to drinking water supplies. In France, several nuclear power plants, which rely on river water for cooling their reactors, had to reduce output or temporarily shut down entirely because the water available was either too scarce or too warm to safely cool the systems. A country that depends heavily on nuclear power for its electricity suddenly found part of its energy grid vulnerable to the same heat wave threatening its hospitals. High in the Alps, glaciers that had survived centuries of ordinary summers melted at a startling rate. Streams and rivers fed by that melt swelled dangerously, even as the broader drought dried up everything else around them. A strange contradiction playing out in mountain valleys across France, Switzerland, Austria and Italy simultaneously. Wildfires broke out across the drought-stricken landscape of southern Europe, particularly in Portugal, which battled some of the most severe fire seasons in its modern history that same summer. Firefighters already stretched thin by the sheer scale of blazes found themselves working in temperatures that made their own jobs dangerous in an entirely new way. Even museums and cultural institutions felt the impact. In some facilities lacking adequate climate control, the extreme heat damaged sensitive artifacts and specimens. An unexpected casualty of a disaster most people associated only with human suffering. All of this unfolded within the same brief window, roughly 3 weeks, that saw the human death toll climb into the tens of thousands. It was a reminder that a heat wave of this magnitude doesn't simply make people uncomfortable. It reaches into agriculture, energy infrastructure, water supplies, and ecosystems all at once, stress testing nearly every system a modern society depends on, simultaneously and without warning. France bore the heaviest human toll of any single country, but the same deadly heat was settling over neighbouring nations at the same time, and in some of them, the death toll would climb even higher than France's own devastating numbers. France dominated headlines, but it was far from alone. Italy, it would later become clear, suffered the highest death toll of any single country during the 2003 heatwave, with estimates reaching around 20,000 deaths. Much like in France, the elderly bore the overwhelming brunt of the crisis, particularly in southern regions where summer heat is typically more intense, but where infrastructure in many areas remained similarly unprepared for an event of this scale. Spain recorded close to 13,000 deaths tied to the heatwave, a toll that unfolded alongside its own severe wildfire season as drought-stricken forests across the country burned even as hospitals filled with heatstroke patients. Germany, despite a climate generally considered milder than its southern neighbours, still recorded roughly 9,500 deaths, a sobering reminder that no country in Europe proved fully immune to the crisis, regardless of how mild its typical summers usually were. The United Kingdom, Portugal and the Netherlands each recorded death tolls in the thousands as well, rounding out a continent-wide catastrophe that, when finally totaled, exceeded 70,000 lives lost. What made this especially remarkable was how similarly the crisis unfolded in each country. Nearly everywhere the same pattern repeated: elderly victims, disproportionately those living alone, dying primarily in the hottest, most humid stretches, with official recognition of the disaster's true scale arriving weeks after the worst damage had already occurred. Public health researchers who later compared data across these countries found something else notable. Nations with more developed heatwave preparedness plans, built after previous smaller-scale heat events, tended to fare somewhat better. Countries caught more completely off guard, as France largely was, saw disproportionately higher death tolls relative to their population size. This comparison became one of the most important lessons to emerge from 2003. A heat wave of this magnitude wasn't an unstoppable force of nature that every country was doomed to suffer equally. Preparation, early warning systems, and infrastructure built specifically around extreme heat could measurably reduce the death toll even when the underlying weather event itself was identical. That lesson would ripple outward across the following decades as country after country began building the exact kind of heatwave response plans that, in the summer of 2003, had simply not yet existed anywhere in Europe. But first, the full, staggering scale of the continent-wide disaster needed to be understood, a number so large it would take researchers months to fully calculate and confirm. 70,000 people. That is roughly the number of seats inside a large American football stadium filled completely, every single seat holding a person who died because of 3 weeks of extreme heat. This was the final estimated death toll across Europe from the 2003 heatwave, once researchers completed their excess mortality calculations months after the crisis had ended. It stands as one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern European history, surpassing the combined death tolls of many hurricanes, earthquakes, and floods that receive far more lasting attention. Numbers this large are notoriously difficult for the human brain to process. Psychologists who study this phenomenon call it psychic numbing. Our capacity for empathy tends to peak with a single identifiable victim, and actually decreases as the number of victims grows into the thousands or tens of thousands. A single person's story, a name, a face, a specific apartment building, moves people emotionally in a way that a raw statistic like 70,000 simply cannot. This may help explain why the 2003 heatwave, despite its staggering toll, never achieved the same lasting cultural recognition as disasters with far smaller body counts. Hurricane Katrina, which killed under 2,000 people 2 years later, remains deeply embedded in public memory, studied in classrooms and referenced constantly in discussions of disaster preparedness. The European heatwave, which killed roughly 35 times more people, faded from broad public awareness far more quickly outside the countries directly affected. Part of this comes down to how each disaster unfolds. A hurricane offers dramatic footage, flooded streets, collapsed buildings, a clear before and after narrative. A heatwave offers almost none of that. The devastation happens invisibly, inside individual bodies, individual apartments, individual hospital rooms, spread across 3 weeks and an entire continent. There's no single image that captures the scale the way a flooded city does. Yet the human cost was, by any measure, staggering. 70,000 families lost someone, 70,000 individual lives, each with its own history, ended earlier than they should have, largely because of a weather event that modern medicine, modern infrastructure, and modern governments simply weren't prepared to handle. This wasn't the first time a heatwave had exposed exactly this kind of vulnerability. 8 years earlier, on the other side of the Atlantic, a smaller but strikingly similar disaster had already offered a clear warning, one that, in hindsight, deserved far more attention than it received. Before Europe's catastrophe, there was Chicago's. In July 1995, a brutal heatwave settled over the American Midwest, pushing temperatures in Chicago to 106 degrees Fahrenheit, with wet bulb readings that made the heat feel even more extreme. Over the course of about 5 days, the city recorded roughly 739 heat-related deaths, a staggering toll for such a short window of time. The pattern that emerged in Chicago was, in almost every meaningful way, a preview of what would happen in France 8 years later. Victims were overwhelmingly elderly. Many lived alone, in apartments without air conditioning, in neighbourhoods where social isolation ran deep. Poorer neighbourhoods, particularly those with large elderly populations and fewer community support networks, suffered dramatically higher death rates than wealthier areas just miles away, even when the temperatures were nearly identical. A landmark study of the Chicago disaster, later expanded into a widely read book, closely examined why some neighbourhoods lost so many more residents than others, despite facing the exact same heat. The answer came down largely to social connection. Neighbourhoods where people knew each other, checked in on each other, and had accessible public spaces to escape the heat saw far fewer deaths. Neighbourhoods marked by isolation and distrust, even those that were not particularly poor, saw death rates spike dramatically higher. This research, published well before the 2003 European disaster, essentially predicted what would happen in Paris, that isolation, even more than raw temperature, would determine who lived and who died. And yet, when France faced its own heat crisis 8 years later, there is little evidence that lessons from Chicago meaningfully shaped the country's preparedness or response. The two disasters happened on different continents, studied by different researchers, discussed largely within different academic and policy circles that rarely intersected. This gap reveals something important about how societies learn, or fail to learn, from disasters. A clear, well-documented warning existed. The mechanisms behind it had already been carefully studied and published, but without a coordinated global effort to share and act on those lessons, the same deadly pattern was allowed to repeat itself on a much larger scale less than a decade later. It would take the sheer scale of the European disaster, 70,000 deaths compared to Chicago's 739, to finally force sustained international attention onto exactly the kind of vulnerability that Chicago had already revealed. Two disasters, thousands of miles apart, driven by the exact same underlying failure. Heat finding the loneliest, most disconnected members of a community first. Heat waves have a reputation as an equal opportunity disaster, striking rich and poor neighbourhoods alike under the same relentless sun. The data tells a very different story. Across nearly every major heatwave studied by researchers, from Chicago in 1995 to Paris in 2003 to more recent events, one pattern holds remarkably consistent. Poorer neighbourhoods suffer significantly higher death rates than wealthier ones, even when both experience identical temperatures. Money buys protection from heat in ways that are easy to overlook until you examine the data closely. Air conditioning is the most obvious factor. Wealthier households are far more likely to have it, and far more likely to be able to afford running it constantly during a prolonged heat wave, rather than rationing its use to save money. But the advantages extend well beyond a single appliance. Wealthier neighbourhoods tend to have more green space, more trees providing shade, and building materials that absorb and radiate less heat than the concrete and asphalt common in denser, poorer urban areas. This creates what researchers call the urban heat island effect. Certain neighbourhoods can run measurably hotter, sometimes by several degrees, than others in the very same city, based almost entirely on their physical infrastructure and how much vegetation surrounds them. Access to healthcare plays a role too. Wealthier residents are more likely to have regular doctors monitoring chronic conditions that heat can worsen, and easier access to emergency care if something does go wrong. Poorer residents, particularly elderly ones living on fixed incomes, may delay seeking medical attention even as symptoms worsen, simply due to cost or transportation barriers. Social isolation compounds all of this. The Chicago research found that even accounting for income and health factors, neighbourhoods with weaker social connections, less trust between neighbours, fewer accessible public gathering spaces, saw significantly higher death tolls. Poverty and isolation often reinforce each other, leaving the most vulnerable residents facing the greatest risk with the fewest resources to protect themselves. This pattern carries an uncomfortable implication for the future. As heat waves become more frequent and more intense due to climate change, their impact will not be distributed evenly across society. Without deliberate effort, extreme heat will continue to strike hardest exactly where communities are least equipped to survive it, deepening existing inequalities rather than simply adding a new universal threat on top of them. Understanding this pattern became one of the most important shifts in how scientists and policymakers began approaching heatwave preparedness after 2003. But it also raised a much larger question that researchers were only beginning to seriously investigate. Was climate change itself making disasters like this one more likely to happen in the first place? In the years following the 2003 heat wave, a new question emerged among climate scientists. Could this specific disaster be connected to the broader trend of a warming planet, or was it simply an extraordinarily unlucky roll of the weather dice? This question led to the birth of an entire new field of climate science known as attribution research. Rather than simply studying long-term climate trends in the abstract, attribution scientists developed methods to examine individual extreme weather events and calculate how much more likely, or how much more severe, human-caused climate change had made that specific event. The methodology works by running sophisticated climate models twice, once reflecting the real world, with its accumulated greenhouse gas emissions, and once simulating a hypothetical world without those human-caused emissions. Comparing how often an event like the 2003 heatwave would occur in each scenario reveals how much human influence increased its likelihood. When scientists eventually applied this method to the 2003 European heatwave, the results were striking. The research found that human-caused climate change had made a heat wave of that severity dramatically more likely to occur, turning what might have been an extraordinarily rare, once-in-many-centuries event into something far more probable in the modern climate. This finding transformed how the 2003 disaster was understood. It stopped being viewed as pure bad luck, an unfortunate but essentially random weather anomaly, and started being recognised as an early devastating preview of a pattern that would only intensify as global temperatures continued rising. That shift in understanding carried enormous weight. If extreme heat waves were becoming measurably more frequent and more severe due to climate change, then events like 2003 were not a one-time historical tragedy to mourn and move past. They were a preview of a new, ongoing risk that societies needed to actively prepare for, rather than treating each new heatwave as a surprising, isolated event. Attribution science has continued to evolve significantly since 2003, and researchers can now often calculate these connections within days of a heatwave occurring, rather than the years it originally took to analyse the European disaster. This speed matters enormously for public understanding and policy response, allowing scientists to clearly communicate in close to real time when a specific dangerous heat event has been made significantly worse by ongoing climate change. The 2003 heatwave, in this sense, became more than a historical tragedy. It became a foundational case study, one that helped launch an entire scientific field dedicated to understanding exactly how much more dangerous our warming climate was making events like it. And in the decades since, that danger has continued to climb, showing up again and again in heatwaves around the world, each one testing whether the lessons of 2003 had actually been learned. Numbers can make an abstract danger feel concrete, and the numbers behind the 2003 heatwave's connection to climate change are worth sitting with. Climate scientists estimate that human-caused warming made a heatwave of that severity multiple times more likely to occur than it would have been in a world without industrial greenhouse gas emissions. Some analyses suggested the event's probability had increased by a factor of 2 or more, transforming what should have been an exceptionally rare occurrence into something with a meaningfully higher chance of happening in any given summer. To put that in perspective, imagine a lottery where your odds of winning, or in this case your odds of experiencing catastrophe, doubled or more simply because of gradual ongoing changes to the atmosphere across the previous century. That's essentially what attribution scientists found when they modelled the 2003 heatwave against a world without human-driven climate change. This wasn't a story about one freak summer. It was a story about shifting baselines. As global average temperatures continue climbing, the range of what counts as a normal summer shifts upward too. Events that would have been considered extraordinarily rare a century ago become, gradually, less rare. Heat waves that once might have occurred once every few centuries start showing up every few decades instead, then potentially even more frequently than that. Researchers have continued applying this same attribution methodology to heat waves that struck in the years and decades following 2003, and a consistent pattern has emerged. With each additional fraction of a degree of global warming, the odds of extreme heat events climb higher still. Some of the most severe heat waves recorded since 2003, in Russia, in Western Canada, in Europe again more recently, have shown attribution results suggesting they would have been nearly impossible without the influence of human-caused climate change. This growing body of research carries a sobering implication. The 2003 European heatwave, devastating as it was, may not represent an extreme outlier from a bygone era. It may represent an early example of a new normal, a preview of the kind of extreme heat events that will continue happening with increasing frequency as the planet keeps warming. That warning would not stay theoretical for long. Within just a few years of 2003, new heat waves would strike other parts of the world, each one testing whether governments had actually absorbed the hard lessons Europe had just learned, and each one revealing in its own way just how difficult those lessons were to fully apply. 7 years after Europe's catastrophe, an eerily similar disaster struck Russia, on a scale that would eventually surpass even 2003's staggering toll. In the summer of 2010, an intense and prolonged heat wave settled over western Russia, pushing temperatures to record highs and triggering a severe drought across the region. On July 11th, the southern Republic of Kalmykia recorded a temperature of 111 degrees Fahrenheit, among the hottest readings ever documented in the country. The drought that accompanied this heat sparked catastrophic wildfires across enormous stretches of Russian forest and peatland. Smoke from these fires blanketed Moscow and surrounding cities for weeks, creating a toxic haze that made breathing dangerous even for people who managed to avoid the direct heat itself. This combination proved even more lethal than the heat alone might have been. Researchers estimate that up to 56,000 people died as a result of the combined crisis: heat stroke, respiratory failure from the smog, and a disturbing number of drowning deaths as people desperate to cool off, including some who had been drinking heavily, took to rivers, lakes, and pools without adequate caution. Once again, many of the same patterns from 2003 repeated themselves. Elderly and vulnerable populations bore the heaviest toll. Hospitals and emergency services struggled to keep pace with the surge in patients, and the true scale of the disaster only became clear well after the fact, once researchers compiled excess mortality statistics rather than relying on death certificates that rarely mentioned heat directly. What made the Russian disaster particularly alarming to climate scientists was how it reinforced the exact pattern attribution researchers had identified in France 7 years earlier. Subsequent analysis found that this heatwave too had been made significantly more likely by human-caused climate change, adding another data point to a rapidly growing body of evidence connecting individual extreme heat events to the broader warming trend. The disaster also carried a distinctly modern warning. As climate change intensifies both heat waves and the drought conditions that often accompany them, the combination of extreme temperatures and wildfire smoke may become an increasingly common and increasingly lethal pairing, adding a second, less obvious killer stacked directly on top of the heat itself. Russia's tragedy showed that the lessons of 2003, however clearly documented, had not yet translated into universal global preparedness, and within just over a decade, another disaster, this time in a place known more for its cold than its heat, would deliver that same lesson yet again, in a country that considered itself among the best prepared in the world for climate disruption. Lytton, British Columbia, is a small town most Canadians had never heard of before the summer of 2021. For several days that June, it became the hottest place in the entire country, hotter even than most of the tropics, before it was gone entirely. An extraordinary heat dome settled over Western Canada and the Pacific Northwest in late June 2021, shattering temperature records by staggering margins across the entire region. Lytton itself recorded a temperature of 121.3 degrees Fahrenheit, an almost unbelievable reading for a Canadian town, breaking the country's all-time heat record by a wide margin, not just by a fraction of a degree. The human toll was severe and swift. Across British Columbia alone, the coroner's service confirmed 619 heat-related deaths tied directly to the event, making it one of the deadliest weather disasters in the province's history, unfolding over the course of just about a week. Then, the day after setting its record-breaking temperature, Lytton burned. A wildfire fueled by the extreme heat and tinder-dry conditions swept through the town so quickly that residents had only minutes to evacuate. Much of the town was destroyed entirely. Scientists conducted attribution research on this event with unprecedented speed, given how far the field had advanced since 2003. their conclusion was stark. This heatwave would have been virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. Not simply more likely, but statistically almost impossible in a world without the warming humanity has already caused. This distinction mattered enormously to climate researchers and the public alike. The 2003 European heatwave had been made significantly more likely by climate change. The 2021 Pacific Northwest heat dome represented something further along that same trajectory, an event that increasingly looked like it belonged to an entirely different, hotter world than the one earlier generations had grown up in. Canada, a country whose national identity is often built around cold winters and mild summers, found itself grappling with the same brutal lessons France had learned 18 years earlier: aging populations without air conditioning, warning systems not built for this scale of heat, infrastructure simply unprepared for temperatures nobody had thought possible in that part of the world. The disaster in Lytton offered a particularly vivid, almost symbolic warning. A town that had just set a national heat record was, within 24 hours, erased by fire born from that same heat. It stood as a stark illustration of how quickly extreme heat can escalate into an entirely different kind of catastrophe, and how little separates a dangerously hot week from a genuine life-altering disaster. There is a specific number that scientists believe marks the outer edge of human survivability, and the world is beginning to brush up against it in places nobody expected. Earlier we discussed wet bulb temperature, the combined measure of heat and humidity that determines how effectively the human body can cool itself through sweat. For years, scientists treated 35 degrees Celsius, about 95 degrees Fahrenheit, as the theoretical absolute limit. At that wet bulb reading, even a perfectly healthy young adult, resting in the shade with unlimited water, would eventually die from heat exposure, because the body would have no way left to shed heat at all. More recent research has actually revised this number downward, suggesting the true danger threshold may be closer to a wet bulb temperature of 30.6 degrees Celsius, meaningfully lower than the original estimate. At that point, researchers found that healthy test subjects reached what they called their critical environmental limit, the point where the body's core temperature simply could not stop rising, regardless of effort or hydration. This lowered threshold matters enormously because it means dangerous, potentially fatal wet bulb conditions have already been recorded in the real world, not as a distant future possibility, but as documented events happening right now. Locations in South Asia and the Persian Gulf have already recorded brief spikes brushing against or exceeding this threshold, roughly a dozen times in recent years, according to climate researchers tracking the data closely. These extreme readings have, so far, been brief, typically lasting just an hour or two before conditions ease. But climate models suggest that as global temperatures continue rising, the frequency and duration of these extreme wet bulb events will increase substantially, potentially reaching the point where some regions of the planet become genuinely dangerous, or even uninhabitable, for extended outdoor exposure during certain parts of the year. This isn't a distant, abstract concern reserved for climate scientists alone. It represents a hard physical limit on where humans can safely live and work without extraordinary technological intervention like air conditioning. Something 35 degrees wet bulb makes essentially irrelevant if someone doesn't have reliable access to it. The 2003 European heat wave never approached this most extreme threshold, but it didn't need to. It demonstrated on a massive scale exactly how lethal heat, well below the absolute survivability limit, could still become when combined with vulnerable populations, inadequate infrastructure, and a slow, unprepared response. As wet bulb extremes creep closer to this genuine biological limit in more places around the world, the stakes of getting that preparation right only continue climbing. If you want to see where extreme wet bulb temperatures are already becoming a reality rather than a future projection, look toward the Persian Gulf. Coastal cities in this region combine two ingredients that make for exceptionally dangerous wet bulb readings: extreme heat, often exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit during peak summer months, and extremely high humidity, driven by the warm waters of the Gulf itself sitting immediately adjacent to these cities. That combination creates conditions capable of producing some of the highest wet bulb temperatures recorded anywhere on the planet. Cities including those along the coasts of the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Iran, and Pakistan have recorded brief wet bulb spikes brushing against, and in a small number of documented cases exceeding, the 35 degrees Celsius threshold once considered the theoretical limit of human survivability. These extreme conditions have so far remained relatively brief, often lasting just an hour or two during the hottest part of the afternoon before easing slightly. But climate researchers tracking the region closely warn that both the frequency and duration of these dangerous conditions are expected to increase substantially in the coming decades as global temperatures continue climbing. For wealthier residents in these cities, powerful air conditioning provides a critical buffer against this growing threat, allowing daily life to continue largely uninterrupted even as outdoor conditions become genuinely life-threatening for extended exposure. But this creates exactly the same inequality pattern seen in Chicago and Paris, magnified to an even more extreme degree. Migrant workers, who make up a substantial portion of the labour force across much of the Gulf region and frequently perform physically demanding outdoor work, face dramatically higher exposure to these dangerous conditions, often with far less power to simply retreat indoors when temperatures spike. Some Gulf nations have implemented mandatory outdoor work bans during the most dangerous midday hours of peak summer months, an acknowledgement that traditional safety guidelines, built around a cooler climate baseline, no longer adequately protect workers from genuinely lethal conditions. This region offers a preview of a challenge that will likely spread to other parts of the world as global temperatures continue rising. Engineering entire cities and labour systems around heat that pushes right up against the genuine biological limits of human survival. It represents an entirely different scale of challenge than what France faced in 2003. Less about isolated elderly residents caught off guard by an unusual heat spike, and more about entire populations needing to fundamentally restructure how and when they can safely exist outdoors at all. Ask most Americans to name the country's deadliest weather threat, and hurricanes or tornadoes usually top the list. The actual data tells a very different story. Extreme heat kills more Americans in an average year than hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and lightning strikes combined. In 2023 alone, heat was linked to over 2,300 deaths across the United States, and researchers widely agree that number represents a significant undercount given how frequently heat-related deaths get attributed instead to specific conditions like heart attacks or kidney failure, exactly the same undercounting pattern that obscured the true scale of the 2003 European disaster. This gap between public perception and actual risk mirrors almost exactly what happened in France 2 decades earlier. Hurricanes generate dramatic footage, evacuation orders, and extensive news coverage built around a clear, visible timeline. Heat waves unfold quietly, without flooded streets or toppled buildings, making them far easier for both the public and, historically, government agencies to underestimate. Cities across America have increasingly begun studying historical heat disasters like Chicago 1995 and the European catastrophe of 2003 to build better warning systems and response plans. Many now designate official cooling centres, air-conditioned public spaces where vulnerable residents, particularly elderly individuals without reliable air conditioning at home, can escape dangerous heat during the most extreme stretches of summer. Some cities have gone further, creating systems specifically designed to check in on isolated elderly residents during heat emergencies, directly addressing the exact vulnerability that Chicago's researchers identified as the single strongest predictor of who dies during a heat wave and who survives. Despite this progress, significant gaps remain. Many American cities still lack the kind of comprehensive, proactive outreach systems that could meaningfully reduce their death tolls, and heat-related death statistics likely remain undercounted nationwide, making it difficult for policymakers and the public to fully grasp the true scale of the ongoing threat. As American summers continue growing hotter, driven by the same climate trends that intensified the 2003 European disaster, cities across the country face a similar challenge. Building the infrastructure, the warning systems, and the community connections necessary to prevent history's deadliest lessons from repeating themselves on American soil. That challenge has become urgently relevant in recent years, as the United States has experienced its own increasingly severe heat waves, and in the summer of 2026, both Europe and America found themselves once again grappling with dangerously extreme heat, in events that showed just how directly the warnings of 2003 still apply today. 23 years after the disaster that reshaped how an entire continent thinks about extreme heat, France faced its deadliest heat event since that catastrophic summer, a stark reminder that the lessons of 2003, however thoroughly studied, remain an ongoing test rather than a solved problem. In the summer of 2026, France recorded more than 5,700 excess deaths during a historic early summer heatwave, marking the country's deadliest heat-related toll since 2003. Public health officials tracking the crisis found that between June 17th and July 2nd, the number of deaths recorded far exceeded what would normally be expected for that stretch of the calendar, a gap of over 5,700 deaths, roughly 36% higher than projected. During the heatwave, temperatures climbed well above 104 degrees Fahrenheit across large parts of the country. Public health officials described the event as unprecedented, noting its early arrival in the summer season, combined with its intensity and duration, exposed nearly the entire population to extreme heat during a period still largely dedicated to school and work. The demographic pattern echoed 2003 almost exactly. Deaths increased across hospitals, private homes and nursing homes throughout the event, with mortality rising sharply, starting around age 45. Adults 75 and older accounted for roughly two-thirds of the toll, representing at least 3,719 excess deaths on their own. Rapid scientific analysis concluded that this late June event was the most severe ever recorded across the affected region, with climate change making it far more likely to occur, echoing almost exactly the attribution findings scientists first developed studying the original 2003 disaster. The World Health Organization reported more than 1,300 excess deaths across the broader region in just the first few days of the crisis alone. This wasn't an isolated French event either, because heat-related death tolls typically require months of excess mortality analysis before a final figure emerges. Researchers noted that recent European summers already offered a sobering benchmark, pointing back to the 70,000 deaths of 2003 itself, along with tens of thousands of deaths tied to the summers of 2022 and 2023. The fact that France, a country that had spent over 2 decades building warning systems, cooling centres, and emergency protocols specifically in response to 2003, still recorded its deadliest heat event since that original catastrophe carries a sobering message. Preparation measurably reduces death tolls compared to a country caught completely unprepared. But as global temperatures continue climbing, even well-prepared nations are being tested by heat waves more extreme than what their systems were originally built to handle. France was not alone in facing dangerous heat that same summer. Across the Atlantic, the United States was enduring its own severe and widespread heat crisis at almost exactly the same moment. While France grappled with its deadliest heat event in over 2 decades, the United States faced its own dangerous and widespread heat crisis during the very same summer. In early July 2026, roughly 150 million Americans across the eastern half of the country found themselves under heat alerts simultaneously, an enormous portion of the nation's population facing dangerous conditions at once. Washington, D.C. was forecast to record its hottest 4th of July on record, with temperatures reaching approximately 101 degrees Fahrenheit, while New York City was expected to hit triple-digit temperatures for the first time in a decade. This heat dome, remarkably similar in structure to the blocking high-pressure system that trapped Europe back in 2003, stretched across a massive portion of the country, from the Midwest through the East Coast. A prolonged heat dome kept tens of millions of Americans under heat alerts and made the week-long event one of the summer's deadliest weather events nationwide. The human toll, while not approaching the catastrophic scale of France's 2003 or 2026 disasters, was still significant and continued climbing as officials processed the data. Officials in New Jersey announced 22 heat-related deaths over a single weekend as the massive heat dome enveloped much of the eastern United States, while additional heat-related deaths were confirmed in Cook County, Illinois and Hinds County, Mississippi. Extreme heat remains the nation's deadliest weather hazard, and this rising death toll underscored once again how dangerous prolonged heat exposure can be, even in a country with far higher rates of air conditioning access than France had back in 2003. Despite the severity and remarkable geographic reach of this particular American heatwave, the kind of mass casualty tolls that defined history's deadliest heatwaves, events like the roughly 9,500 deaths recorded in 1901, or the thousands lost during the heatwaves of 1936 and 1980 were not evident this time around. For now, this event stood out primarily for its record-breaking temperatures and its enormous geographic reach, rather than for producing a death toll that would place it among the very worst heat disasters in American history. That distinction matters enormously, and it circles directly back to everything explored throughout this story. The difference between a heat wave that breaks temperature records without a catastrophic death toll and one that becomes a historic mass casualty event like 2003 or Chicago 1995 often comes down to exactly the factors already covered: air conditioning access, early warning systems, community connection, and how quickly a society recognizes and responds to the danger building around it. Two continents, the same summer, facing remarkably similar heat domes, produced very different outcomes. That gap offers one final crucial lesson about what actually determines whether the next heatwave becomes a survivable inconvenience or another entry in the grim history first written in Paris back in August 2003. 23 years separate the disaster that opened this story from the one that closed it, and the through line connecting them is impossible to ignore. The physics driving both events remained essentially identical. A stubborn high-pressure system trapping heat over a region for an extended stretch, nighttime temperatures staying dangerously high, and vulnerable populations, particularly the elderly, bearing the overwhelming brunt of the consequences. What changed between 2003 and 2026 was not the fundamental danger, it was how prepared different societies were to face it. France's response to its 2026 heat wave, while still recording thousands of tragic deaths, unfolded within a completely different infrastructure than existed in 2003. Warning systems triggered earlier, cooling centres opened. Public health messaging reached vulnerable populations faster than it had 2 decades earlier. None of this prevented the disaster entirely, but the systems built directly in response to 2003's failures almost certainly kept the death toll from climbing even higher than it did. The American heat dome that same summer offered a similar, if less dramatic, illustration of the same principle. Despite affecting an enormous population across a massive geographic area, the disaster did not approach the catastrophic death tolls of America's own historical heat waves from the pre-air conditioning era, a difference driven substantially by exactly the kind of infrastructure and preparedness that simply didn't exist a century earlier. This is in many ways the central lesson embedded in the entire story of the deadliest heatwave on record. Extreme heat itself is not a fixed, unchangeable threat that societies must simply endure and mourn afterward. The actual death toll of any given heatwave depends heavily on decisions made long before the temperature ever starts climbing, whether elderly residents have air conditioning, whether warning systems trigger early enough to matter, whether isolated individuals have someone checking in on them, whether hospitals and emergency services have the staffing and infrastructure to handle a sudden surge. Climate scientists studying attribution research have made one thing increasingly clear. Heat waves of the scale and intensity seen in 2003, in 2010, in 2021, and again in 2026 are becoming measurably more likely as global temperatures continue rising. The question facing every city, every country, and honestly every individual reading this, is no longer whether extreme heat waves like these will keep happening. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests they will. The real question is whether the hard lessons written in Paris apartments, in Rungis refrigerated warehouses, and in Thiers Cemetery back in August 2003 will actually shape how prepared we are the next time a dome of high pressure settles over a city and simply refuses to move.